Thank you very much. I'm going to disappoint you to start with. I won't have any wonderful anecdotes about meeting wonderful poets and so on. What I've decided to talk about, we've had a number of different talks about Jean talking about the Livre d'Artiste and talking about a relation between poems and sets of images. And I specifically want to talk about the book itself. And I see there are a number of students from my MA who are here, and I always like to come up with really bad punning titles for any talks that I give. And obviously we've got our close encounters and open close encounters. And I thought what I really want to talk about is, so we've been looking at printmaking, we've been looking at books, and one of the things that distinguishes the artist book, the printed artist book, is that unlike the work on a wall, these are objects that are designed to be handled, that are designed to be experienced close up. They're designed to be manipulated in a way where you open and close and open and close, rather than being able to see everything at once. And that's really what I want to talk about. And I've brought a couple of books just to give an example of that. A little bit about me and my practice. So I make drawings, I make collages, I'm a printmaker, and I make books. This was one of my very first books, 18 Minutes at Manchester Piccadilly, a screen-printed, small edition screen-printed book describing the experience of having a cup of coffee waiting at Manchester Piccadilly station. I've worked at times with poetry. We had mention of T.S. Eliot earlier, also a great T.S. Eliot fan. This was a piece in response to Eliot's Ash Wednesday, really looking at, in this case, it's letterpress, mainly blind embossed, with certain words picked out at various places, really playing with the tactile experience of absence and presence within the text. This is a screen-printed artist book, really just seeing what happens. These are a whole collection of shop signs observed around Europe. And the idea of this little book is just a collection of those, but an idea of having a book full of texts that you're not actually really meant to read. I thought was an interesting concept for a book. Fragments of text, but no form of legibility. That's from a few years ago. I'm rushing through this because I'm aware people are getting hungry, and actually these are the books that I'm not going to talk about. This was the book that was recently mentioned, which was Black Rock Sequence from a couple of years ago, a collection of 11 poems and images based around the South Dublin coast. These are all screen printed as well, and I could talk at length about that, but I won't. And the reason I'm not talking about any of these books is, in some ways, these books work as images as well as working as a book form. So this particular sequence, if anyone's interested in it, is about to be exhibited at the Poetry Society down off Covent Garden. That opens, well, I put it up tomorrow, and there's a launch of that next Saturday. Anybody who's able to attend would be very welcome at 4 o'clock. What I really want to talk about is, and it goes back to something that Jean mentioned when he was talking about Mallarmé and the coup d'etat, the idea of something that can only exist within the book form, or the actual form of the book is fundamental to the way that you experience it, that idea of opening and closing. And in terms of the book, I just want to read a quote, hopefully if I can read it. And this is from Keith Smith, who's written extensively a number of very interesting books around the form of the artist book. And it's really thinking about how somebody might experience a book. I'll just read this quickly, although you can all read it as well. My approach to seeing a book for the first time is to go through the entire book at least 2 or 3 times at one sitting. The first is at a fast pace, the other viewing successively slower, having been modified by the previous viewing. The book, on the first viewing, theoretically could be upside down. I'm not necessarily looking at the subject matter or reading any words, but seeing the overall layout, the composition of the total book, as well as the individual pictures. The second viewing is less general. I do not turn the pages at a constant pace as previously, but create my own pacing by dwelling on things that either interest me or that I do not comprehend. On the third viewing, I check to see if my previous pacing is altered by what I perceive to be the bookmaker's implied pacing. That also goes a little bit back to the title of the work of this particular talk, this idea of an openness, that the book is something that's created, but it's there for the viewer, the reader, to experience, to play with, to bring their own pacing, to bring their own ideas, to bring their own space to. And I think that's really, really important in thinking of a form that's going to be opened and handled and seen usually quite privately, not publicly on display to walk past on our way to the coffee shop, on our way to the gift shop, but something to be experienced at your own pace to come back to. So two books then that I do want to talk about in a little bit more detail. This is, and I'll just show you what the books look like. This is a book I made a few years ago. It's a small edition. It's a mixture of etching and screen printing. And it's a book that is really a very simple book that plays with an idea of a growing friendship over a period at school, and then the gradual parting of ways, the sort of the loss that happens when that intensity of those years pass, when you go separate ways, how things happen. And what's going on in this book, if you like, very much is thinking of the book as a printmaker, as somebody who's familiar with paper, familiar with techniques, and how the experience of that might be brought to what a viewer might bring to or take from the experience. So this book has been designed really in 2 parts. The first part, which deals with that whole intensity and growing intensity in school, is primarily achieved through etching where screen printing is then coming in. And these are some of the plates. These are some more of the plates. Yeah, more of the plates. And the point of that is, and the point of this as a book that's made to be handled, is that when you actually experience that, and it's been very interesting watching people at book fairs and other things actually reading the book, seeing what they do. At book fair, some people just pick it up and smell it. There are all sorts of strange ways that people encounter a book. But one of the things that starts to happen after a very short amount of time is that people start feeling the surface of the paper, because it's embossed. By using etching, the nature of the etching process is that the paper is pressed into the plate. So you have an embossing. And inevitably, any time I've seen anybody reading this book, what starts to happen is people start feeling it, moving their hands around the plates, the experience of the torn paper, as it looks like, becomes something significantly different. And that's very much how the book is designed. The first part, filled with these rich etchings, filled with other elements. The second part, really dealing with that loss afterwards, loss really possibly the wrong word, becomes a flat space. Screen printing, the ink sits on the surface of the page. There's nothing there apart from the only thing that's left embossed is the watermark, Fabriano watermark from the printer. And it's very much thinking about that as a piece that on the wall, these function obviously as images on a wall, but there's something that's happening through the actual tactile immersion in the book for the viewer that hopefully brings a resonance, a way of thinking about what the book might be that's if you like different, but still bringing in those aspects of printmaking, that knowledge of printmaking, to allow something to happen. So that's one of the books that I just thought I'd introduce. And then the second book, hopefully I'm making up some time here, and you will get to lunch. The second book is a very recent book. Once again, this time it's a screen-printed book. And this is a book that's, once again, designed in such a way that hopefully it can only function as a book. It doesn't make sense in any other form. It doesn't make sense on the wall. And this is a very, once again, very simple idea, this one. It's got no text, apart from a title. It doesn't have a title on the cover. And it's called Open-Ended. And the idea of this book, very, very simply, is that on every, I happen to have turned it that way around, I'll turn it this way around, but it doesn't matter, and that's part of the joy of it. We're used to the idea when we see an image, particularly on the wall, particularly behind a frame, that the image is complete, that we know what it kind of is, and that as a viewer we can sit back, we can interpret it, but we don't have to interact with it. On all of these pages, you kind of have to interact. So it's very simple. It's a combination of one layer that is on tracing paper, heavy duty tracing paper, meaning that there's no actual point where the page is fully completed without the viewer interacting with the paper, interacting with this as a book form. And this is a series of possible interactions, and there's something that happens in the middle of those interactions that you can play with and sort of say, well, what is the actual composition? What's the composition I'm meant to be looking at? How does it actually function? And it's just, as I say, very, very simple. Technically, when you get to the middle of the book, obviously what will happen is that in terms of the pagination, the double page suddenly has a double page of tracing paper, so we have all sorts of different possible interactions that go on there at different places. The book is designed as well with no obvious, it's a square book with no obvious title on the front. So when we get to the end, which way had I started it? I'd started it this way. We eventually get to the end of this book, time for lunch, and what we find is that we get to this point, now it says ended rather than open, which is this point, which allows us to go back and forth into the same series of compositions, but this time experienced in a different order and in a different orientation. The sense of what's going on, if there is any sense of what's going on, is different. So, as I say, this is just a very, very simple simple playing with an idea of a book form, playing once again with, I suppose, a knowledge of printmaking, the quality of paper and what that does, how that affects an image. Those are things that I think any of us who are making work really enjoy. That real sense of understanding what paper will do, what the turn of the page, what the feel of a page might do, and trying to get that possibly across as an experience for somebody just handling a piece of work. So these are, as I say, for those of you who couldn't see those, some of the spreads. And then when you get to the end, it turns that way up and the spreads change. That's as much as I want to say, because I'm aware that we're running very much over time and coming in towards lunch. And hopefully that's given a slightly different insight into a book form and printmaking in a book form. And hopefully there'll be some questions.
There are some questions, yes.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. Could I ask you, did you plan that out carefully, or did it move on as you came across a piece of the transparent paper?
Okay, so in terms of this, in terms of planning, how this was planned, there are two different stages to planning. One is planning in terms of making maquettes, making sketchbooks. Not surprisingly, the actual dummies for these were made completely using collage. The actual then physical planning of the book to print was a technical nightmare in lots of ways, because the ink is going to sit on the paper, particularly on the tracing paper, and start to move it slightly. So getting the different elements to actually line up. So the printing part of it, the making part of it, was very much a planned part. The initial part where I'm making dummies, playing in a sketchbook, using sellotape to put a piece of tracing paper over to see what compositions might be, trying to figure out colour combinations, all of those things was very much intuitive play, really. It started off purely as a project because it was just frustrated with something and just started playing completely abstractly with no other idea in my mind in a sketchbook. And then it started to evolve, and I thought, okay, there is something coming out of this. But I wanted to keep that just playfulness about the shapes. The shapes echo each other, obviously, with the torn circles and so on. But there's no great deep meaning to any of these images. It's purely play.
Yeah, I'm very fascinated by the playing thing. I'm very poor at getting down to playing. I still try to do. So I really do envy you. Thank you.
I'm very much just in that. I'm very much inspired in a piece of work like that by Bruno Munari and his illegible books, and this idea of just playing with the form and with shapes and seeing what could happen. I think it's a nice way of doing things.
I think we have a question on that.
Hi, I thought they're really lovely. I just wanted to ask, did you make them from start to finish, or do you go to a company who produces them or helps?
No, I make them from start to finish.
Even on multiple?
So I make the dummies, make all the stencils, expose the stencils, print them, bind them, choose the book club, etc. Part of the reason for that, don't want to sound negative in any way, as soon as you bind prints, you knock a zero off the value. So when we see a print, we might think, oh, 100 quid, 200 quid, 300 quid. That sounds quite sensible, comparing it to £10,000 for a painting. as soon as we see a book, we go, what, £100 for a book? You must be joking, mate. So obviously, part of it is just the pleasure of making. And part of it is the economics of actually getting somebody else to, well, unless somebody is willing to take on the financial risk, paying somebody to do any of that work would seem economically disastrous, apart from anything else. But an awful lot of it is the actual pleasure that comes from making something precisely and making something well. And I'm sure for any of us who are makers, that is a significant part of what we do. There is a real pleasure. And in printmaking, there is a pleasure of going from an idea where you're generating the ideas in a sketchbook, to then that working out how that might function as layers, being precise about the alignment so it does actually work, and sometimes it doesn't, or even deliberately misaligning to see what happens if you change all of these directions of layers. So that the whole process of making is a significant part of how the work develops. If I was talking about some of the other books, they're very much developed through the whole process of printing layers on top of layers and seeing at what point do I stop and go, yeah, that's kind of nailed it now. So the idea of subcontracting that making to somebody else wouldn't make an awful lot of sense to me.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just one last question. So if you make these individually, how many of them have you made? We've seen one.
So this is an edition of 25. So I make them as editions. So that's most of the books are in editions of about 25. The exception being this one, which is because of the nature of printing all of those etching plates as well as the screen prints. It's a smaller edition. It's only 10. Part of that is figuring out how much of what time I have I want to spend editioning the same piece of work, and how much of that time I want to get moving on to something else. It's a balance between those two things.
Thank you so